Ada Purcell owned the only hop kiln in the valley, and she had kept Effie Danforth standing in her wagon yard for 4 hours before she named a price. Effie's whole crop lay behind her under sacking. 3 acres, picked the day before, going quietly warm on the boards. The kiln stood across the yard, long and low and brick, with a fixed louver running the length of its ridge. There was not another within a day's haul in any direction. 3 acres, Ada said. She had a leather-bound ledger open on the rail and did not look up from it. It isn't the acres, Miss Danforth. It's the loads. 3 acres is 2 loads, and 2 loads is a night of somebody sitting up feeding a fire. I'll sit up. I'll feed it myself. You'll not touch my fire. Ada turned a page. My price for a grower with no kiln is half. The word went into Effie so cleanly that for a second she did not feel it. Half the crop. Half the crop. Still no unkindness in it. That was the part Effie would remember for a long time afterward. That Ada said it the way a person says the price of nails. You're welcome to think on it, though I'd think quickly. Your binds came off yesterday. Half. Effie did the sums standing right there, because a grower does sums the way other people breathe. Hops come off the bind holding 4 parts, water to every 1 part of themselves, and from the moment they leave the vine they have about 1 day to be dried down to 1/10 of that. Miss it, and they mold in the sack and are worth nothing at all. 1 day, 3 acres. She could not haul them anywhere else in time. She could not let them sit, and the only fire within reach belonged to the woman turning pages in front of her. Ada had inherited that building from a husband 10 years dead and had run it alone ever since, in a trade that had no other women in it, and Effie had always thought there ought to have been something between them because of that. There were 2 men in the yard who heard it. Sim Roach, who drove for Ada, and Marcus Stoll, who bought for a house that shipped as far as London and who had been civil to Effie every year of her life. Marcus looked at the ground. Take it, he said. I've watched people refuse that price. I watched Rule Ambler stand right there and refuse it. Take it, Effie. Then he turned and walked away toward his wagon, and did not look back at her. And that was somehow worse than Ada's ledger. Effie walked home the long way so the children would not see her face first. 3 acres of hops lay on her wagon under sacking, going quietly warm, and every hour of the walk she felt the clock of them running. Under that sacking the wet was already looking for somewhere to go. She did not know it yet. It would be another 8 days before anybody told her. But that was the whole of the problem, and the answer to it was never going to be a bigger fire. She had been 16 the summer she came into this valley, and she had come the way most hands came, walking, with a blanket roll, hiring on for the picking. 8 seasons she had done it. 8 seasons of standing in a row beside the crews that came down every August from the Sound and from up the coast. Hundreds and then thousands of them. More people in the yards in those 6 weeks than lived in the town the rest of the year. She had learned hops the way you learn a language you are not taught, with her hands, in other people's fields, for 80 cents a day. Then she had bought her 3 acres with it. Every dollar of it. And the valley had gone right on calling her the picking girl. Nettie was on the step when she came up the track, 12 years old and already able to read her sister's shoulders from 200 feet away. What did she say? She said half. Cal Danforth came out behind her, 9 and barefoot, holding the chalk he was not supposed to have. Half of what? Half of everything we grew. The boy worked at it for a moment. Then what's left for us? Effie stood in her own dooryard with 3 acres rotting on the wagon behind her and found that she did not have an answer to give a 9-year-old. Behind the house, the hop yard stood stripped in green gold in the evening. 40-foot cedar poles strung with wire, the binds hanging emptied. It had taken 11 days to pick. It had taken 8 years to buy. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me tomorrow. She did not sleep. At 3 in the morning, she got the mare into the traces and started for the kiln at the far end of the valley. 11 miles. Because 11 miles was the only other kiln in the world as far as her wagon was concerned. She made it in 9 hours. The road ran up out of the bottomland and along the dry side of the foothills where there was no shade, and there is nothing to do on 9 hours of that road but count. She could still do the sum without thinking. The way you can say a prayer you were made to learn. 80 cents a day, and a good picker in a good year got 38 days out of an August and a September. $30.40 a season, less what you ate. 8 seasons of that, laid end to end, and never once spent on anything that could be worn or drunk, came to $185 in a tin under a floorboard, and $185 in this valley. Bought 3 acres of second-rate bottomland with 2 acres of worthless scrub thrown in, because the man selling it wanted rid of the whole parcel at once. She had planted the poles herself, 120 cedar poles, 40 feet each, set 4 feet down and strung with wire. In the spring of the year, she turned 22, while people drove past and did not stop. And she counted what half would cost, because that sum would not leave her alone. Half of 41 sacks is 20. 20 clears the wire and the tacks and nothing else. No seed poles. No boots for Cal. No margin against a bad year. Ada Purcell had not asked for a share of the profit. She had asked for exactly the part that stood between owning the ground and working somebody else's. By the 4th hour, she could smell what was happening under the sacking. Wet hops in a heap do not simply sit. They work. They generate their own heat the way green hay does, and the deeper you go, the hotter it gets, and she had 2 feet of them. At the Kellerman yard, a hired man cut 1 sack open with a knife and put his arm in past the elbow and drew it out again without saying anything. The outer 6 inches were still green. The heart of the sack had gone the color of weak tea. "You'd have wanted to be here by 9, he said. Not unkindly either. Nobody in this valley was unkind. That was what made it so hard to fight. She drove 11 miles home with the load and burned it. She did it in the fallow strip at the bottom of the yard, well away from the poles, because mold in a heap will find its way onto a bine, and then you have lost next year as well as this one. Cal wanted to help, and she would not let him near it. Nettie stood and watched the whole thing without a word, which was worse. 3 acres, 41 sacks it should have made. It made none. 2 days later, she learned that Reuel Ambler had lost his whole holding that summer of 1883. He had stood in Ada's yard exactly where Effie had stood, had said no to half, had gone home to think about it, and had come back the following morning to say yes. And one morning was one morning too many. There was nothing to appeal to. Under Washington Territory law, a man who owned a kiln was under no obligation to fire it for anybody, and no obligation to name the same price twice. 2,200 pounds of hops, an entire season off a man's whole holding, gone brown in the sack while he thought it over. He was 50 years old, and he had been growing in that valley since before the railroad came through, and he sat on the rail of his own empty wagon with his hat in his hands like a man at a funeral. "She didn't do anything to me," he said, when Effie came down. "That's what I can't get hold of. She never did one thing to me. She just owns the only fire." Effie walked her own boundary that evening trying to think, and she came to the ragged end of her ground where nobody ever went. 2 acres of scrub timber. Little crooked stuff, alder and fir that had come up in the cutover, none of it big enough or straight enough to sell to a mill for anything. It was the part of her land that had no value, which was why it had come with the rest of it cheap. She stood there a long while. They do not owe me a kiln, she thought. There is no law that says a woman with a fire has to share it, and there is no law that says what she may charge. And I've been standing in that yard for 4 hours asking to be given something nobody is obliged to give. So stop asking. She looked up at the crooked little trees for a long time before she went in. Everyone in the valley knew about Hannah Bartle without knowing anything about her. An English widow at the far end of the road past 60, who kept goats and did not come to town, and who had opinions about hops that people repeated as a joke. Effie walked down there on the second morning of September with a picking basket of the season's last cones on her arm because she did not know how else to arrive. Hannah looked in the basket, took Effie's wrist and pushed her hand down into the cones, and held it there. "What do you feel?" "They're warm." Wrong answer. Anyone can say warm. The old woman's accent came off her like a place Effie had never been. "Are they warm and dry, or warm and wet?" "Your hand knows." "Your eyes are no use to you here at all." Effie stood with her arm buried in her own crop and understood, slowly, that she did not know. "Wet," she said at last. "There. Now." What have you been asking Ada Purcell for? Use of her fire. That is the wrong question, and it is why you have been losing. Hannah let go of her wrist. "I was born in Kent. I was 9 years old the first time they put me on a drying floor." 60 years, girl, and I will tell you what nobody in this valley seems to have troubled to learn. Drying is not a thing you do with heat. Heat is the cheap half. Any fool can build a fire. Then what's the other half? Where the wet goes. Hannah pointed up at nothing, at the air. Your cones are 4/5 water. To dry 3 acres, you have to take out something better than 1.5 tons of water and put it somewhere. It has to leave. If it cannot leave, it sits in the room, and the room turns sour, and your hops go the color of a penny. Ada Purcell has a beautiful fire in a building that will not let the wet out. That is all that is wrong with her, and it is enough. Effie sat down on the step without being asked. In her particular case, there was no appeal to be made anywhere, not to a court, not to a neighbor, not to the buyer. In her county, the whole of a grower's year turned on whether one woman felt like lighting a fire. And in his county and the next one over it was the same story with a different name on the ledger. 1.5 tons, Effie said. Out of 3 acres, nearer 2, if your bines came on well. Now think what that means. Hannah held up one finger. You have to boil away the better part of 2 tons of water using nothing but a wood fire in the sky. And you have to do it before the crop turns on you. And you have about a day. There is no arrangement of firewood on this earth that does that by heat alone. Heat only lifts the water off the cone. Something else has to carry it out of the building, and if nothing does, then you have simply moved the water from the hops into the air, and the air will give it straight back to them the moment it cools. That's what happened in my sacks on the road. That is exactly what happened in your sacks on the road, and it is what happens every night in Ada Purcell's roof space. And the only difference is that she is doing it slower and in a nicer building. In Kent, Hannah said, we built them tall. Not long, tall. A tower. You put the fire at the bottom on an open hearth, and you put the hops 9 or 10 feet above it on a floor of laths strung with wire, 1 layer only, and the whole building becomes a chimney. Heat goes up through the bed, takes the wet with it, and goes out the top. And that works. That works when the wind is standing still, which it never is. The old woman smiled for the first time. So on the top we put a caul. A wooden cone on a spindle, with a long vane on it, and the wind pushes the vane and the caul turns, and it turns its back to the wind. Always its back, so the wind goes over the mouth and drags. It pulls. You are not blowing anything, you understand. You are letting the weather pull the wet out of your crop for you all night, for nothing. Effie thought of Ada's kiln lying long and low in the bottom of the valley behind its windbreak row, with a fixed louver along the ridge that faced whatever way it had faced since it was built. Hers can't turn, she said. Hers cannot turn. Effie was quiet. You want to know the whole of it? Hannah said. Drying is a trade of the hands. It never became a science. A thermometer will tell you how hot your room is. It will not tell you where the wind is standing. Don't hold the heat in, girl. Give it the right road out. That is the whole trade, said Hannah. Everything after that is carpentry. She walked the 4 miles home in the dark, saying it over. Not as a comfort. She had no use for comforts that week, but as an instruction, the way you carry a set of figures you were afraid of forgetting. In her county, there was not one grower who thought about drying as anything except the price of somebody else's firewood, and she had been one of them 8 days ago. She thought about the sacks on the road. She thought about the 6 inches of green and the tea-brown heart, and about a roof space in the valley bottom with water hanging in it every night of the season, and about a woman with a ledger who had never once in 10 years had cause to wonder whether the thing she owned was actually any good. Nettie was still up when she came in, sitting at the table with the lamp turned low, which meant she had been waiting. What did the old woman tell you? Effie set the empty basket down and said it out loud for the first time, slowly, the way a person repeats a direction they mean to follow. I don't hold the heat in. I let the wind choose where it leaves. Word got up the valley that week. The picking girl had been to the Mad Englishwoman's and was cutting timber. She's building a woodpile, Ada Purcell said in the wagon yard, and the men laughed. They started cutting on the 8th of September, and Effie learned inside a day that she could not do this alone. Sophie Jack came up the track on the second morning with 11 of her crew. Sophie was Puyallup, about 40, and had been running picking gangs here since Effie was a girl standing in her row. You paid your crews the day they finished, Sophie said. Every year, some don't. I can't pay anybody now. I know what you can't do. Where do you want them? 60 logs. That was the count Effie worked out on the back of a feed bill, and it turned out right within 2. The tower wanted to be 12 feet on a side and 22 feet tall, and at that size you can build it out of small crooked stuff if you square the timber and notch the corners, which is exactly what the useless end of her land had been growing for 15 years. They squared then with a broadaxe. Cal's job was the chalk line, snapping it down each log so his sister had something to cut to, and by the 4th day he was doing it unasked and getting it straight. Nettie's job Effie invented on the 3rd evening, standing in the half-built frame with her neck aching from looking up. I need to know the wind. It's windy, Nettie said. That's not knowing it. I need which way and when it changes. She put the chalk in the girl's hand. Every hour on that wall. Write the hour and the direction, and don't guess. Go out and feel it on both cheeks first. Nettie got it wrong for 3 days. She wrote what she expected instead of what was happening, which is the commonest mistake there is. Then on the 4th day, she came in and said the wind had swung south at 2 and gone back north by 5, and it had. And after that, she never wrote a wrong one. Why does it have to be so high? Cal asked, flat on his back looking up at it. Because a chimney pulls harder the taller it is, Effie said. If I give it 22 feet of climbing to do, it pulls the wet up out of the hops the whole way. If I only gave it 8, it'd sit there being warm. She kept the tally on the inside of the door, because a person who does not count their own work believes afterward that it was easy. 62 logs cut, 2 split wrong at the notch and burned. 410 feet of squared timber. 11 days of Sophie's crew giving her their mornings, days those women were not earning 80 cents elsewhere, and Effie wrote everyone down with a name against it and paid them the following August at $1, because by then she could. They got the frame to 14 feet on the 9th day, and it rained that night hard. And the northeast corner settled 2 inches into ground she had not drained properly, and the whole face went out of plumb. They took it down to the 9th course and did it again. 2 days. She did not cry in front of the children about it, but she went down to the fallow strip where she had burned her crop and stood there a while first. Ada Purcell rode up on the day they finished the last course and sat her horse at the gate, looking at 22 feet of squared, crooked timber standing up out of a stump field like a lighthouse that had wandered inland. She did not say anything at all. She looked at it a long moment, turned her horse, and went back down the track. The first time Effie had ever seen her fail to have a remark ready. The drying floor went in at 9 feet, laths of split fir laid across joists, and between them wire strung tight enough to walk on and open enough to see daylight through from below. Effie bought the wire on credit against next season's picking, 40 pounds of it, and the storekeeper wrote it in a book and looked at her over his spectacles while he did it. Below the floor, an open hearth of stone against the north wall with the brick flue climbing beside it. Above the floor, nothing. Just 22 feet of tapering timber going up into a cone, and at the very top a hole. Then the cow. She made it out of cedar shakes over a hoop frame, a cone about 4 feet across, and set it on an oak spindle, greased so it could turn. Off the back of it she ran the vane, a flat board 11 feet long, wide as her forearm, sticking straight out into the air like a weather vane's tail on something enormous. The first time they raised it, it stuck. It sat up there with the wind coming hard off the foothills and did not move an inch, and Effie stood in the stubble and felt 9 days and 60 logs and 2 acres of her own timber sitting up there refusing. She heard quite clearly Ada Purcell saying the word Woodpile in a wagon yard 1,100 yards down the hill, standing under a cone that would not turn. It would have been an easy thing to believe her. Don't hold the heat in, Effie told herself instead, and went for the ladder. Hannah came up the next morning on a borrowed mule and made Cow climb up with a pot. Not oil, she called up. Oil goes gummy in the dust, and then you have a worse problem than you started with. Mutton fat, warm it first. Cal greased the spindle. He came down. They stood in the field, Effie, the 2 children, an old English woman and a mule, and watched. The vane swung. The whole cone came round slow, like a head turning, and settled with its open mouth pointing away down the valley. "It's hiding from the wind," Nettie said. No. Hannah was watching it with an expression Effie had not seen on her before. "It is putting its back to the wind. That is not hiding. Look at the mouth of it. The wind is going over the top of that hole, not into it. And air going over a hole pulls out of it. 60 years and I have never once got tired of watching that." Effie stood there in the September stubble with her arms crossed and the ache going out of her shoulders for the first time since August. "Don't hold the heat in," she said, half to herself. "Give it the right road out," said Hannah. They laid the first fire that night to season the timber, a small one, and Effie climbed the ladder to the drying floor and lay flat on the wire with her cheek against it and felt the warm air coming up through the mesh at her all along her body, moving, going somewhere. Sulfur she bought at the chemist's in town, in a paper sack, 12 pounds for the first load, to be burnt in the hearth with the wood. It lifted the color and the smell of the cones, and every drying house from Kent to the Puyallup used it. She fired it empty for 2 nights first, which Hannah had insisted on and which Effie had thought was waste. It was not waste. The green timber wept and shrank, and the third course sprang a gap wide enough to put 2 fingers in, and she chinked it with moss and clay by lantern light at 11 at night. And if there had been 3 acres of hops on the floor above her while that happened, she would have lost the lot. She learned the fire in those 2 nights the way she had learned hops by hand. A big fire did not dry faster. A big fire scorched the underside of the bed and drove the heat up so hard it went through the cones without taking anything with it, which was the same mistake as building the tower too short, only upside down. What the bed wanted was a low, steady hearth kept at one level for a day and a night, and a person willing to get up every hour and feed it 4 sticks and no more. That clean, bitter smell went up with the wet. through the whole building and out the top of the cone, so that, for a week in September, you could stand a quarter-mile off and know by your nose alone whether the Danforth place was firing. It was the first thing she had built that announced itself. She was ready on the 22nd of September. The second crop of the season came off on a Tuesday, not 3 acres this time, but the 10 sacks of late-picked vine ends and second growth she had managed to bring on, and a hired load from a neighbor who was willing to gamble a small parcel on her because his own was going to sit 5 days waiting for Ada. 10 inches. That was the depth Hannah had said. 1 layer, 10 inches, no more. And the reason was so simple that Effie could have recited it. Heat and air have to pass through the whole bed, and a bed too deep dries on top and stays wet in the heart, and the heart is what molds. Effie loaded 14. She did it on purpose. She stood on the drying floor at 8 in the evening with the whole of both loads at her feet, and she thought, 1 firing instead of 2. 1 night instead of 2 nights. And she raked it out to 14 inches and told herself the tower was taller than any oast in Kent and would pull harder for it. She sat up all night and fed the hearth and did not sleep. At 4 in the afternoon of the next day, she went up the ladder and put her hand down into the bed the way Hannah had taught her, past the wrist, past the elbow. The top 4 inches were perfect, crisp and papery, and that smell. 6 inches down it was warm and wet, and it had begun already, that faint sour thing at the back of the nose that means it is started and will not stop. She took out what she could save, and it was a little better than 2/3. The rest she carried down the ladder in her arms, load after load, and burned in the same fallow strip where she had burned the first crop, and Cal came running down the field crying because he thought he had raked it uneven. "It wasn't you," Effie said. She had to say it twice before he heard it. "Listen to me. You did your part exactly right. I put 14 inches on a floor that wanted 10 because I wanted to be finished a day sooner. That's the whole of it. That's mine." She sat on the ladder afterward and made herself name it properly. She had held the heat in. 14 inches of bed on a floor that wanted 10. And the wet in the middle of it, with nowhere on earth to go. The exact thing the old woman had warned her about, done by her own hands out of impatience. The tower had not failed. She had crowded it. It was around the valley by Friday. Ada Purcell heard it in her own wagon yard, and Sim Roach reported that she had smiled and said, "Well, there's the difference between a kiln and a woodpile," and gone back to her ledger. And the yard had laughed the way it laughs. And on the Saturday the wind went round into the southwest and stayed there. It did not gust and swing the way it does most weeks in that country. It came steady out of the southwest for 3 days and nights without shifting a point, and it came across the bottomland into the tall row of windbreak firs that Ada's husband had planted along the south side of the kiln yard 30 years before, to protect the building. And behind that row, in the still air, Ada Purcell's fixed ridge louver, a beautiful piece of work, cut and set to face north, sat with nothing at all moving across it. Her fires burned. The heat came up. The wet went up into the roof space and had nowhere to go and hung there, and came back down. Ada Purcell lost 3 loads in 3 days that autumn of 1883, and she had never lost 3 loads in a season before in her life. Sim Roach told it afterward to anybody who would stand still. How they had built the fires up on the second night thinking the wood was wet. How by the third night there was water running down the inside face of the brick and dripping off the tie beams onto the bed, and a man could stand on that drying floor and watch his own breath. 900 pounds a load, and 3 of them, and every ounce of it went out on a wagon to be sold for stuffing at $1 the hundredweight when it should have brought 11. That was 2,700 pounds. It was more than Reuel Ambler had lost in August, and Reuel Ambler had lost everything he owned. And 1,100 yards away, up on the rise, a cone of cedar shakes with an 11-foot tail swung slowly round into the southwest, put its back to it, and pulled. Marcus Thole cut the 2 sacks open in his own yard at midday, in front of 11 people, because a buyer who ships to London does not take anybody's word for anything. It was the hard, flat light of the end of a Puyallup September. No shade anywhere in the yard, the dust standing up off the wagon track where it had not rained in 9 days. He cut Ada's first. He put his arm into the shoulder and brought up a handful and let it fall through his fingers where everybody could see, and the cones came apart brown at the edges and clung together slightly. And there was that smell. "Second load of the week," he said. "Same as the last 2. He cut Effie's. The cones came up out of the sack pale green and loose and rattled going back down, and half the yard heard it, because a properly dried hop makes a sound. He did not look at Effie when he spoke. He looked at a Purcell, standing in her black dress in the middle of a yard she had ruled for 10 years, with her ledger under her arm. "I bought off this valley for 14 years. Mrs. Purcell," Marcus said, "I've bought off you the whole of it. I'd not have believed I'd stand in my own yard and say this, that I'll be taking the girls before yours, at 3 cents over, and I'll take everything she can dry." Then he turned to write it down, and this time he turned away from Ada. Nettie and Cal had come in on the wagon with the sacks and were standing at the tailboard with a picking basket apiece, the way they had stood in the yard at home 100 times that month. Effie took a handful out of Nettie's basket. Then she walked out into the middle of the yard where the light was worst, flat white noon, no shade anywhere in it, and opened her hand flat, palm up, with a mound of her own green cones on it, and held it out, not to Marcus, who had already decided, to Ada. "Take some," she said. "Feel them. Your eyes are no use to you here at all." Ada Purcell looked at the hops on the girl's open palm. Then she looked past her, up the rise, 1,100 yards off, where a cone of cedar shakes stood against a white sky with an 11-foot vein out behind it. And as they all stood there, the wind came round a point, and the whole thing turned slowly, deliberately, and put its back to it again. "How?" Ada said. "You built a beautiful fire," Effie said. "So did I. The difference is I don't hold the heat in. I let the wind choose where it leaves." 41 sacks came off her 3 acres that autumn and the next. 2 loads every 24 hours, 10 inches deep, and not a finger more. The arithmetic of it went round the valley faster than the story did, because growers are arithmetic before they are anything else. Ada's kiln took a load in and gave it back in 18 hours when the weather sat right, and in 30 when it did not, and it could not take a second load until the first was out. Effie's tower turned 2 loads inside a day and did it whatever the wind did, because the wind was the point of it. A brick building of Ada's size had cost, in its day, something better than $900. Effie's had cost her 40 pounds of wire, 12 pounds of sulfur, a pot of mutton fat, and 9 days. And there was the other sum, the one she did not say out loud to anybody. If she had taken the half in August, if she had signed for it in that yard with Sim Roach and Marcus Thole standing there, she would have carried 20 sacks to market instead of 41, and 20 sacks would not have cleared the wire, the seed poles, and the tax on the parcel. She would have been 2 years off her own ground. Ada had not been trying to ruin her. Ada had simply named a number without ever once doing the sum from where Effie was standing. Ralal Ambler brought his up the hill in November on a borrowed wagon, what little he had left of the late growth, and stood at the bottom of the ladder with his hat in his hands again and could not get the first sentence out. "Bring it up," Effie said. "You're blocking the door." Ada Purcell came up the track alone on a gray morning at the end of the month. She did not apologize. Effie had known she would not, and found, standing in her own dooryard watching the woman get down off the horse, that she did not particularly want her to. Ada looked up at the tower for a while. Then she said, "How long is the vein?" 11 feet. 11. Ada absorbed it. "Mine would want longer. The building's wider. longer and higher off the ridge than you'd think. It has to sit up where the wind's clean. Yours has 30 years of fir on the south side stealing it. Those trees were put there to protect the kiln. I know, Effie said. That's why nobody ever thought to cut them. Ada stood a moment with that. I'll buy the design of it, she said. Name a figure. I'd rather pay you than have half the valley think I stole it off you. And here it was, the thing Effie had been carrying since August, the thing she had turned over on 11 miles of road with 3 acres going brown behind her, and on the walk back from the Englishwoman's, and on every one of the 9 days of building. The chance to name a number to Ada Purcell. No, she said. No, I'll not sell it to you. I'll give it to you. Effie wiped her hands down her apron. And to Ruel, and to the Kellermans, and to anybody in this valley who wants to come and stand in that doorway and be shown. Free. This week, next week, any week, Ada's face did something complicated. You understand what that does to me. It doesn't do anything to you. That's the point. Effie looked at her steadily. If I sell it to you for money, then there's a woman in this valley who owns the only fire, same as before, and only the name on it has changed. I'm not interested in being you. I'm interested in there never being another August where somebody like Ruel Ambler stands in a yard and gets told half. Nettie was in the doorway. She had been there some while. You asked me a question in August, Effie said to her without turning round. You asked what's left for us, if she takes half. I remember. That's what's left for us. That, up there. She nodded at the tower. Nobody can take half of a thing you've already given away. You'll want it longer than you think, Effie said at the gate, when Ada was up on the horse again. And higher off the ridge. Don't hold the heat in. Let the wind choose where it leaves, and it will do the pulling for you all night for nothing. Ada Purcell rode down the hill, and 8 days later, a man came up the track from her place to ask, politely, how you keep a spindle from going gummy in the dust. Mutton fat, said Effie. Warm it first. By the end of the following August, there were 4 of them standing in the valley. Effie's on the rise. One at the Kellerman place, built short and squat because the ground there is high already and they did not need the height. One on Ruel Ambler's, that he and his 2 sons put up in 11 days, and that leaned very slightly to the east and worked perfectly well anyway. And one on the ridge of a long low brick building down in the bottomland, where Ada Purcell had opened her roof, set a spindle into the ridge beam, and raised a cone with a 14-foot vane on it, and had taken a cross-cut saw to 9 of the 30-year-old firs on the south side of her own yard, which the valley talked about for longer than it talked about anything else that year. Hannah Bartle came up in September to see it. She was past 65 by then and did not build anything anymore and did not want to. She sat on the bench outside Effie's door with a cup she never finished and looked at the tower and past it, at the 3 others visible from that rise, all 4 cones turning slowly and independently as the afternoon wind came round. In Kent, she said, you can stand on a hill and count 30 of them going at once. Is it a fine thing to see? It is the finest thing I know, said Hannah. That autumn, a man came in from the Nisqually side who had 4 acres and no kiln, and had heard there was somebody up here who would show a person how. He came up the track and found a girl of 13 chalking figures on the outside wall of the tower, the hour, and a direction, in a column going back down the wall for 1.5 feet. I'm after the woman who built this, he said. She's inside. What is it you want to know? I want to know how it works. Nettie Danforth looked up at the cone turning above them both, and she said it the way she had heard it said in the yard at noon, the way she would go on saying it for the rest of her life to anybody who came up that track and asked. You don't hold the heat in, she said. You let the wind choose where it leaves. There is a thing that happens in a valley when one person stops asking to be let in. Effie Danforth did not break Ada Purcell. She did not take her yard or her trade or her good name, and she did not stand over her. She simply built a taller, poorer, uglier thing out of 60 crooked logs than nobody had wanted, and put on top of it a roof that could turn, and then she gave the turning away to everyone for nothing, until the word half stopped meaning anything in that country at all. The picking girl bought her ground 80 cents at a time. What she left behind was not the ground. It was 4 roofs and then 40, all of them quietly putting their backs to the wind so that the wind would do the pulling. Thank you for staying to the end. If you would have taken Ada's money instead, tell me in the comments. Like and subscribe.